we examined the first two consequences of original sin. Illusion, not knowing where true happiness is to be found, and concupiscence, which is looking for it in the wrong places, or perhaps too much in the right places. And the third one is that if you ever find out where true happiness is to be found, or think you found out by means of some kind of reading or conversion or preaching or simply the difficulties of life that forces us to enter into ourselves and reevaluate the principles on which we're functioning. And this third one is that the will is so weak that even if you find out where true happiness is, you can't do anything about it anyway. Well, obviously, this is a very dim view of human nature. I'm sorry, it happens to be the truth. And what is interesting is, in this great scientific age that we are in, not only does modern psychology reinforce this idea, these three ideas, but it gives us a detailed diagnosis to work with as to exactly what the kind of effects are step by step in our emotional life. Well, the great teachers of the spiritual life were aware of this too, and they put it in slightly different forms with their somewhat crude knowledge of psychology. But they divided some of these details into what they call the capital sins. So these are not sins as such, but tendencies to sin rooted in these three instinctual needs, and which begin to emerge as scenarios, as ways of reacting to frustration, which obviously is going to happen almost every day when the emotional programs for happiness are not fulfilled. And of course, I should add that there are other factors that affect what our response is going to be. They're genetic factors, they're temperamental factors. You can sometimes discover in the Enneagram some of the details of one's natural endowment as to how you react to other people and situations. But it's a little complicated for some people, and so I recommend just one very simple breakdown that was proposed by Karen Horney, maybe 40 or 50 years ago, in her book Neurosis and Human Growth. It's a marvelous examination of conscience based on psychological wisdom and knowledge. But there she says the child normally will respond, and this is going to be its basic response throughout life, to difficulties or frustration in one of three ways. Either by fighting back, and this is the aggressive temperament, or by withdrawing. This is the child who just doesn't fight back, but who withdraws from the situation and avoids conflict without ever resolving it or its own needs. And finally, there is the child that develops a dependency on the strongest person in the environment and expects them to take care of it or rescue it or defend it and so forth. Well, obviously, you can't count on others to fit in 100% to one's particular needs, especially when these are outrageous. And the nature of the emotional programs for happiness is that they are unlimited. They have no boundaries. They were put in place at an age when we didn't have the use of reason, which tends to moderate the excesses of our behavior if it's working properly. So these poor people then who are under the domination of these emotional programs for happiness simply go on getting more and more rooted in the need for gratification on those three levels, and the needs then become demands. And when they become demands, then it affects other people, and that it interferes with your relationships with other people, with yourself indeed, and with God. So the formation of the false self as a result of the development of these energy centers is one aspect of the human condition that is extremely important to grasp. And once again, I remind you that the intensity of the energy that we put into gratifying these demands is much more than we realize. And it's the purpose of the divine therapy to begin to roll back or unload the energy from the unconscious so that we begin to see how exaggerated they are and how many of our decisions are influenced by them, including very significant ones. And you would think that when we come to the age of reason, maybe 14 or 15, or at least when we became adults, we would use this immense energy of human reason to evaluate the values or programs that we've been living out of all our life, but not at all. The false self simply uses these new powers to think up bigger and better ways of gratifying them, and thus bigger and better ways to assure that its life is going to be miserable. And so it's into this situation that divine life comes and divine love. And how can things be any different than a little bit confrontational? And indeed, here is what the gospel really says to us in answer to this problem that is so pervasive. Repent. This is a word that comes from originally with John the Baptist. Jesus repeated it. Its real meaning is change the direction in which you're looking for happiness. Unless we do this, the inevitable consequences is going to be a life in which our demands for unlimited gratification, insecurity, approval, or power issues is just going to become bigger and worse. And this sets off another dynamic, and that is the addictive process. The addictive process is a device that the false self develops to hide once and for all the terrible pain, emotional pain, that it's dimly and perhaps not at all aware of in the unconscious that is secretly influencing its behavior. And so this is one of the great breakthroughs of the spiritual journey, is when one begins to realize that our problem is not just with conscious misbehavior or conscious disvalues, but the big issue is with the unconscious values that we don't even know about, and hence this is one of the great purposes of the inner room, to provide an atmosphere and an interior silence and a quieting of the mind so that the body receives such deep rest that it begins to evacuate or unload the emotional damage or the undigested emotional material from the earliest moments of life, or perhaps even in the womb. These, for some reason, these feelings have to come to consciousness to be dissipated. Feelings are only energy, and hence it's when we accept them and, so to speak, sink into them and make them our own and then let go of them without either projecting them on others, where we can dislike others more comfortably than ourselves, or where we can let go of the tendency to identify with them, which usually leads to acting them out. And whenever we act out one of these programs for happiness, it goes through a cycle that only reinforces the program and makes it worse. There's another aspect now that must be looked at that is also an integral part of the formation of the individual self, or the ego. And this takes place during the socialization period of the child, which is generally identified as 4 to 9 or 10. And this is a period where the child begins to interrelate with its energy centers with other peers or children who have the same problem. And hence the problems of relating, if one has a sharp eye, usually hark back to what the experiences, the earliest experiences of each of these children are. When the children get into a fight, they may not be disliking each other. They're fighting the other person from a place in their unconscious that was deserved, that really deserved some defense. But because that is unknown to them, it's that hatred or that wound is transferred to somebody else, and for less reason, and hence we're constantly unloading on other people the unresolved unconscious wounds that we bring with us from early childhood and which are deeply embedded in the psychological unconscious. Well, in the socialization period then, the normal experience of children is to unquestioningly absorb the values or the ideas or the attitudes or the behavior of parents, teachers, peer groups, I suppose the television and the internet now, or whatever is considered and they don't have much reason yet, or whatever is the going belief systems of their particular environment. So remember that here is the time now where the energy centers look for symbols of gratification in the culture. Okay, so now the child wants this toy, not just because it's greedy for possessions, but it's getting a little more complex. Its logical mind is beginning to form. So it may see in that toy as a symbol of its mastery or dominance or supremacy, you might say, over a sibling who doesn't have that toy. And hence, it's mine. No, it's mine. It's mine. And so you get people, these youngsters, battling over who's going to possess the sandbox. But the tragic thing is after this people grow up, they haven't undertaken the divine therapy or entered the inner room and practiced the difficulties of taking themselves in hand and facing the dark side of their personality. They begin to figure out more and more ways of projecting it on other people. In other words, we develop defense mechanisms so we don't really see the problem. And this is the addictive process. It's basically an invention to avoid ever facing the pain of some trauma in early childhood that really was serious, significantly serious, or a situation that developed into seriousness by the prolonged character of it, such as being separated from parents for a long time at an early age, or having been ill oneself, or having been abused in some form. The damage to the emotional life of a child by abuse, whether brutality or sexual abuse, is incalculable. And this experience, because it's imposed on a child at an age that it has no means to deal with this experience, seems to have consequences that may last for life. For instance, a child may decide that because of this horrendous experience, sexuality, it never wants to have sex, never wants to be married, and hence to these people, they may see in religious life or in any kind of celibate commitment the perfect way, unconsciously, of never having to face this problem of their wounded sexuality. And we know from those who work in this area with people who've been so afflicted that the great tragedy is that the child tends to blame itself because it needs usually the other person, especially if it's a parent, for its security needs. So it doesn't want to hate the parent or condemn the parent, and so the net result seems to me that in the end it tends to blame itself for something of which it was totally innocent, or something which was inflicted on us, and from those experiences comes deep doubts about one's self-worth. And although there are other sources of a lack of self-esteem, the highly competitive atmosphere of American culture, but suffice it to say that the child tries to find in the symbols of the culture, whatever that is. Now this is so interesting because the false self is so ingenious and so deeply embedded that it doesn't care if you change your environment or your way of life. For instance, you could be a great executive climbing the corporate ladder to ever-increasing heights of, and then suddenly you're converted and decide to enter religious life or some ministry. So you sell all your excessive goods, you change your address, you may put on a religious habit, you may change your hairdo, and all kinds of things will change. So the false self says, fine, it has no objection to that. As long as we don't ask it to change, it has no intention of dropping dead upon request. And as long as we change our environment without modifying the worldliness that was the motive for our social climbing in a different environment, we will now find ourselves inclined, at least, to do some social climbing in the new environment, however religious, however spiritual it is. So that the false self even gets into the life of prayer. And we may find ourselves competing with other people as to how much time we spend in prayer, how many prayers we say, whether we're more advanced in the spiritual journey than they do. This is not religion. This is simply the expression of the false self in a somewhat more respectable garb than it had before. And hence, this is why Jesus is so strong, even to the point of harshness, in urging us to cut off our attachment to the emotional programs for happiness. As example, if your hand scandalizes you, cut it off. Well, from a perspective of moral theology, you can't do that. So we need to remember that a wisdom teacher always exaggerates in order to get a point across, to capture your attention long enough to communicate some more deeper truth. So what is really meant by that somewhat outrageous saying is, if one of your energy centers, that is, one of your most cherished programs for happiness, in which you put enormous investment of energy and time and resources and thought and contacts and relationships, if that is as dear to you as your hand, cut it off, because with those worldly dispositions, you cannot go through the narrow gate. You cannot experience the kingdom of God, which is on the other side of the eye of the needle. And you have to let go of that useless baggage, which is not just useless baggage, but which is harmful. And if there was security guards or systems in the spiritual life, that's the kind of baggage they should look into before you let them into the church. Leave your worldly motivation behind. Unfortunately, it's not so easy. It's easier said than done. And so Jesus is fully aware of exactly what the problem is. And we see him working it out with his disciples and friends, just as the Holy Spirit, through the divine therapy today, is using exactly the same methods, the same gentleness, the same encouragement, the same patience, in order to persuade us, in spite of all kinds of opposition to grace, to begin to let go of the thing that ultimately is killing us. The consequences of original sin lead to death. Everybody dies. So I consider something that leads to death as a serious illness. Well, to get back to the other aspect of the formation of the individual self and the socialization period, we now begin to identify with our roles. We're a student, we're an athlete, we're a soccer player, we have friends a little later in adolescence, we're a ladies' man, we're a great athlete, we're a serious thinker preparing for a life of teaching in a great university. Whatever it is, we begin to spend this precious time of adolescence, which in actual fact is a period in which we're invited to look into the full meaning of life, if we had the time or we weren't pushed into trying to prepare for our future job or our education or our social life, so that given the attitudes of contemporary society, there's no encouragement or support to speak of for the brain, which about 16 is completed in as far as its basic evolution is concerned, and is now prepared for the spiritual journey because its intuitive faculties are now fully in place. And so this over-identification with our group and family, ethnic group, nationality, or religion is the source of all kinds of human social ministry that you only have to look around the world today to see what it was. And it transcends one's religious persuasion. If we look at the tragedy of Rwanda, for instance, 88% of the people there at the time of the massacres were Christians, and perhaps 80% were Roman Catholics. The question arises, did somebody preach the gospel to these people? If they did, they evidently never heard it, because when they turned on each other, they turned on even on their families and relatives in their mad loyalty to an ethnic set of values that was all pervasive. So they evidently never heard the gospel. So it raises the question for missionaries, is there a distinction between teaching religion and teaching the gospel? Apparently there is. You can teach people to go through the practices, but the most important thing to teach them is the human condition and the solution that the gospel offers, first to moderate, and then to undermine, and then to destroy the false self in all its ramifications. This is the project of divine transformation, and that's why God needs a kind of private office to initiate that process. And the private office is the inner room, that is to say, the spiritual level of our being, where we're cheek to jowl, so to speak, with God, and are open to the gradual revelation brought about through the natural process of the body's evacuation of harmful material through the unloading or evacuation of the unconscious. This de-rolling process is also fascinating. Here is where nature supplements the divine therapy if one is alert to it. So now we've identified, let us say, with our profession, or we're a father or a mother or maybe a minister, or a professional person, and we're drawing our identity from that role. And that's okay. What is not okay is the over-identification with it, which prevents us or takes away from us the capacity to step back or withdraw from this organization or particular cultural group if their values contradict the gospel, or if the gospel or if the Spirit calls us to a new kind of life that would mean leaving behind the one that we had looked for, perhaps for years and years, as our support system. So what is so delightful about a support system, like a group or a community that we identify with, is the fact that if they accept us, we can more easily accept ourselves. And the doubts that we have about ourselves are handled, or one doesn't have to look at them because we're accepted by the group. But suppose we break with the group and don't accept something that they consider essential to belong to the group, this is the kind of rift that may lead to or be caused by a deep conversion, a realization that we're other than our group. Yes, we're social beings. Yes, we're individuals, but the truth is we're both of them together at the same time. They're essentially interrelated. You cannot ever stop being separate, individual, nor at the same time essentially related to every other human being, and more particularly to the group from which we emerge. And so this is precisely what the divine therapy is meant to heal. And the cross of Christ, or the crucifixion of Christ, is the symbol of the death of the individual self. This, I submit, is one of the deepest meanings of the Paschal mystery, that seeing Jesus let go of his identity, so to speak, on the cross as the Son of God, at least it seems to have been obscured, and to enter into identity with sinners precisely in their consequences of sin, which is utter misery, invites us to recognize that the false self that we have lived off of, and which we have all kinds of support systems to keep it in place, is not the source or way to happiness, but actually obstructs human happiness.